White and Chalk, Squeeze my Ghostkeeper. Good morning. My name is Maya Ghostkeeper, and I'm a proud member of the West Bank First Nation. And our school has been on the road to reconciliation, and we have felt it was only right to honor someone who has been in the forefront of Canada's reconciliation journey. Therefore, our school thought it was only fitting to recognize the Honorable Mary Sinclair, former chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as one of our Canadian heroes. Thank you for joining us, Your Honor, and for agreeing to answer a few of our questions. One of our first questions was that, how would you yourself define the truth of reconciliation?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you for the honor of being recognized as one of your members of your Hall of Fame or whatever it is that I may have the name wrong. I apologize. Yeah, the question of what is truth and reconciliation is a very important question. Generally, the idea of Truth and Reconciliation Commission started in the early 1960s, and they're almost always used in conjunction with commissions. So they're usually called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. First one was in Argentina in 1962. And probably the most famous one was the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, Canada had its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When you look at the history of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, in those 60, I think there's 64 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions now that have been held around the world. When you look at the background to each of those, they're all very contextual, which means that they are all a result of what's going on in those countries at that time. Some of them are created by government, some of them are created by international bodies, some of them are created by an agreement between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous entities. So they are unique to their particular country. So we need to keep that in mind. So I think it's fair to say that you probably can't say that what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is all about in Canada is the same as what it was about in South Africa or what it was about in South America. So because they're all unique to their circumstances. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came about because beginning in the early 1990s, a number of Indigenous residential school survivors sued the government of Canada and sued the churches that ran residential schools for the injuries that they sustained while they were there and for the fact that they were taken away and had their culture and language taken away from them. And so they filed those lawsuits beginning in 1990. And by the early 2000s, there were thousands and thousands of those suits. There were about 32,000 lawsuits filed all across Canada. And so by order of the court, all of those suits were brought together in one large lawsuit called the class action lawsuit. And that class action lawsuit was presided over by judges in each of 7 provinces: Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Ontario, if I didn't say that already, Quebec, and the Maritimes. And the purpose of amalgamating them all together was to make it easier for the courts to come to a determination of whether or not there was a legal obligation or legal liability that arose because of the way the government of Canada ran those schools. And in a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada called Blackwater, Willie Blackwater was a residential school survivor, and he sued a residential school worker, and he won. And he won. He didn't ask for money. He just asked for a declaration that the church that ran the school and the government were responsible to him. So the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the government of Canada was 75% responsible for what went on in the schools, and the church that ran the school was 25% responsible. And so based on that, all of those lawsuits were going to go ahead, utilizing that principle. And so the idea was then to figure out a way to not have to do 36,000 lawsuits. And so the parties representing all of those people who were in those lawsuits got together with the government, with the churches, with survivors, and agreed to look at setting up an agreement, a settlement agreement, to keep the lawsuits from going to court. And so the settlement agreement was reached in 2006. It was approved in 2007. And one of the terms of that was the establishment of a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the reason they established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was because by the virtue of the settlement agreement, survivors who were suing the government or who were claiming injuries were not able to testify in court anymore. And so they couldn't get their stories out, and they wanted to get their stories out. So the purpose of our TRC was to allow the survivors to be able to testify in public and get their stories out. So we established, so I was appointed to head the TRC in 2009, and we started our hearings in 2010. And one of the first things that we did was we started to invite anybody who wanted to tell their story publicly to come forward, and we would record it and make a note of what they had told us. And then we also allowed people to speak privately and record their stories that way. Everybody who testified was given a copy of their statement, video copy, as well as a transcript, and so they could have it for the future. And so overall, we heard from quite a number of survivors. We traveled all across the country recording those stories. And the purpose was to hear the stories of survivors in order to establish a sense of what happened in those schools. So we were not obligated to make a finding. In fact, we were told we could not make a finding of legal responsibility. That was left to another process. Our finding was to be based upon the overall stories that we were hearing. So based upon all of the stories that we were hearing, all of which were televised, we concluded a number of things about what went on in the schools, and then we reported on that, and we made a series of recommendations, which we called calls to action, and asked the government, the churches, survivor groups, and provinces to work towards a reconciliation focus. And reconciliation, in the context in which we used it, was to establish a better relationship based on mutual respect. So that's how we approach the issue of reconciliation. So the word truth is pretty limited. So it basically means something that is accurate, something that is true. But reconciliation has a number of possible definitions to it. And so we put our own definition to it by saying that reconciliation is about reestablishing a relationship founded on mutual respect, which was the nature of the relationship at the outset, the contact between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And then it moved away from that. But what we said is that that initial contact relationship needs to be reestablished. So mutual respect was the key to the relationship. But what we also said was that Canada spent so long damaging their relationship with Indigenous people that we need to understand that Indigenous people have to be given an opportunity to develop their self-respect first, so that they are on an equal footing to non-Indigenous people. So reconciliation requires both a relationship between two parties of mutual respect, but also an opportunity for the oppressed party to develop a sense of self-respect. So in other words, to heal from the oppression that has been going on. That's a long answer to a short question, but at the same time, it's a good question and it's a complicated issue.